I wonder if we could start, panel, by asking the Paxman-esque question that Alexandra posed. Why is or was FIFA so ghastly? Richard.
Thank you. I think what we've seen this morning is they're the symptoms, not the cause. I think the cause is not just about FIFA, but about other international governing bodies. Who governs the international governing bodies? It's a question I asked when I was sports minister on many occasions, and I used to go across to FIFA. I did to many other international governing bodies as well, and that is a central question, because I think that was brought out very clearly. Who is it? And that is the problem, because it was what was happening, which has now come out, clearly well obscene. But as I was saying a little earlier when we were chatting in the room out there, I dealt with FIFA on a number of occasions, particularly around the bid for the World Cup, but also in trying to bring better governance into football. And Nick will tell you that we tried to bring some of that into our own FA here. But when you go out abroad, as I did on one occasion, and just to I think elevate what you've just been said about the obsessors that you got in FIFA, I was on one occasion abroad and was invited not to the VIP but the VIP reception, which is the inner sanctum then, and there was an organist playing there, and I said, "Who's he?" He says, "That's Sepp Blatter's personal organist. He takes him around the world." I thought, well, when you get to that level, then it is really shows what the obsessors are. But the central question, I think, and I hope it'll be discussed today, is who actually governs the international governing bodies? And that was a central question that was asked when we were bringing in, and Dick Pound, I've no doubt, will deal with this as well. How did we actually get the internationalisation of the code for the World Anti-Doping Agency? And I think the central question here today is we've got the symptoms there. I think that the cause is that lack of international governance. I think it can be done. I think WADA has led the way in that through the UNESCO conventions. And I think it's something that really ought to be now given very serious consideration, whether it's FIFA, whether it's IAAF, whether it's tennis, whether it's golf, or any of those others. This is really, I think, the debate that's going to bring good corporate governance into the management of international sport.
Jane, how did FIFA get to the stage they were at?
Well, I think Richard's absolutely right. There was nobody overseeing them, and that was the situation that endured for many years, and it allowed a culture to build up, which Alexandra has powerfully outlined, became the norm. It is difficult. There is nothing and no one at international level who oversees these bodies. It's different at national level. Now, I've always been very keen to make sure that this narrative, sport is broken, doesn't wash over and tarnish British sport, because I think we have a different story to tell, both in the sector I used to work in football, and the sector that I now work in, which is publicly funded. It's a little bit easier for us because we have, thanks to the generosity of the lottery ticket buyer, quite substantial funding that we can give to sports, both to fund elite success and participation. And while we're not a regulator, we can use that as a lever to say, you've got to work in this way, guys. You've got to do it like this, and that's a condition of funding. I think in the absence of that, and obviously that factor, that kind of government involvement is not present with the private sector of sport in this country or at international level, then you need to kind of backfill somehow and say, well, who can do that? And part of the answer to that is greater transparency. Ask sports to put more information and more data into the public domain and let the media and the fans do their work, which they will. They do in football, and I've seen some of that. I mean, Nick, I think, would agree that at the Premier League, everything we did was heavily scrutinised. And while that could be difficult and pressurised, goodness, I welcomed it. I was so glad there were journalists tracking what the clubs were doing, what we were doing. We were held to that kind of account.
Nick, football is the world's game, isn't it? So you talk about corporate social responsibility. It should have more social responsibility than any other sport because it represents so many people. So how on earth did FIFA get to this stage?
I think evidence suggests, and that was a pretty compelling story, that normal corporate governance thinking doesn't apply. This is Dick's point and Jane's point. It doesn't apply at international federation level because it's really based on ideas as to what the stakeholders or the shareholders expect and require of those organisations of which they're part owners. It doesn't apply at international federation level. Because I think if you're looking at FIFA, you have to look at their electorate. You have to look at the constituents, and that's the confederations, and the federations, and the model beneath FIFA delivering up who they deliver up. So that those accountability mechanisms don't work. Therefore, I think there has to be a different kind of approach. I think there has to be an approach where you have to look around at creating more of those awful women and men in those decision-making, and I've been one many times, more of those people, independent non-executive directors in our corporate UK governance kind of language and world. I think the only people who can do that probably are a combination of the IOC and government, actually, operating at that level, pretty much to impose upon organisations, not just like FIFA, but IAAF, list them, there's enough of them, that they have to have, for instance, independent non-executive directors, serious ones, who have been appointed by an organisation like the IOC or UNESCO or whoever it is, whose job it is to hold people to account, to ensure there's transparency, to actually shine a light, that light on everything that's going on in an organisation, which would cover everything from pay, contract, tendering processes, procurement, bidding processes. Why we have a bidding process which is on a one member, one vote, which we know is designed to create a certain kind of behaviour. Well, have an independent tendering process, a procurement process. Here's the objectives we want you to achieve. This is the timeline. This is the independent scrutineer who will advise as to who the winner is. There will be a winner. End of debate. All that stuff, I think, can be remedied, but it has to be driven by a different corporate governance approach. And I think government and IOC have to be the leads on that.
Very interested to hear your insight, Richard, in a second as to the whole bidding process. Yeah. But before we do that, I want to ask, bring Jonathan in as well. Jonathan, I'm just looking at the indictment, the US indictment against FIFA. Rampant, systematic, deep-rooted corruption, racketeering, wire fraud, money laundering. It's quite a rap sheet.
It certainly is, and it's interesting that it has to be US indictment. Yeah. And it's the criminal law.
Was that crucial, do you think, that it came from the US?
I didn't see it coming from anywhere else. And it's the criminal law, and it's the US. And I think, and I agree with everything that's been said so far, I think one's got to say, what is one trying to govern? Is it a sports body, or is it a business? Because my own view is that there's a woolliness of thinking, that the lawyer in me will say, no one is complaining about the way that FIFA manages Law 12, the offside law of football. What they are objecting to is the event organiser aspect of FIFA. FIFA's constitution was written in 1904 at a time when the aristocrats were running sports. And its constitution remained effectively unchanged throughout the period when the World Cup started in 1930, first televised in 1970. The revenue from the World Cup in 2006 was, quote, only, unquote, £750 million. It was 4.6 billion pounds in Rio. Now, it seems to me that if you look at the problems that international sporting federations have got themselves into, it's follow the money. That's the problem. And my own personal view is that we need to decide, are we trying to regulate a sports body or are we trying to regulate a business? Because what international business with a revenue of 5.6 billion, 93% of which comes from one event every 4 years, which is a one-way bet, will change? And that's what I think we need to do.
This picks up on what you were saying, Alexandra, as somebody who is involved in transparency and governance yourself. Should FIFA be a business? It has responsibilities beyond just purely making money, doesn't it?
Well,
just this very specific question. Sorry to interrupt you before you've even started answering my question. How much money do you think could have gone to football, to people who needed it, to football pitches, that was absorbed into Chuck Blazer's interior design bill?
Well, it's actually a little worse than that, because enormous sums, of course, could have actually made it all the way out to the front lines, but there is the trough that is Zurich, wherever there's a feeding frenzy there. And then there are the individual FAs, and some of the FAs have been just as egregious. They get this development money with almost no accountability. The fact that the money reaches an FA in some far-flung location does not mean it's going for equipment and fields. There's no accountability for that money at all. And to answer your question, it requires more oversight than a business. Right now, it's getting less. But the nonprofit status in the world requires transparency into books and salaries and the org charts and bonuses and the criteria for those bonuses. And Switzerland dropped the ball, if you'll pardon the pun, entirely on this. Swiss law permitted them to look more closely than they did. So, sports body, business, and then more heightened than that is a nonprofit, an organization that is benefiting from nonprofit status worldwide needs to be held to a higher standard.
Jane?
Well, I think that's right, and I think governments have to play a part in this. I think we could look at Switzerland and say, come on, Switzerland, how have you allowed this to happen on your jurisdiction? There are 3 international federations of Olympic sports based in the UK. I'll leave you to try and work out which ones they are, and if you get stuck, I'll be around later and I'll tell you. And I hope, and I think, and I believe, it would be unthinkable for the problems we've seen in FIFA to happen in any of those 3, and a couple of them very big sports, major commercial sports. And I do think it requires government action to make sure that any sporting organisations domiciled on their territory do comply with certain base standards without intervening too much, without becoming a regulator, preserving the much quoted concept of autonomy of sport, which does allow sport rightly to run its own affairs, but does not mean and should not mean that sport is above the law.
Well, let's give the example of Jonathan, because he's absolutely right. Every time he went to see Sepp Blatter, he wanted governments to help, but then as soon as he didn't want governments to help, he always played the card autonomy of sport. Always played that one, eyed behind the autonomy of sport, because sport is not a business. That was his argument. Now, I think there are some fundamental structural problems where you need to decouple regulation from the commercial part, and that is something that needs to happen here in the UK. But is sport a business or isn't? Let's take the UK as an example. Let's take the Premier League. The Premier League argument with the Commission is it is a sport, not a business. They are then given the right to have collective selling, which is an intervention into the market. If you're going to have market forces that's going to regulate, which many businesses in the world out there have market forces, sport is taken out of that and it's given dispensation. It's given dispensation because it can sell collectively 20 clubs with no regulation. That is now yielding £9 billion over 3 years.
And I'll tell you what else it yields. Leicester City winning the championship.
I'm not saying, what I'm saying, is it right or is it wrong? I'm just saying, I'm just putting the case here that you have got an intervention to market. So we have got to decide, is it a sport or is it a business? If it's a sport and we have to actually deal with it as a sport, which I think it is, and that's my view and was when I was a minister, I said that politicians ought to keep out of the running of sport, but we ought to support sport, as we did, as Dick Pound knows, when he had wanted to get the WADA Code accepted internationally. Many of us, as Minister of Sport, actually supported that and brought the weight of government behind that, and we said, right, any sport that does not sign up to the WADA Code, they don't get any public money. That then led to the UNESCO Convention. So there are routes in which you can bring and you can encapsulate sport, but with at least a reasonable sense of governance. But that does have to actually be, I think, clearly defined if you're trying to find the model which is going to be internationalised and is going to bring the accountability that I think most of us want in this room.
Nick?
I can't remember how many times Dick and I have heard this.
We've had this discussion many times.
So, with apologies to those who've heard it before, obviously it's sport and business, of course. And in relation to the business, to say that the Premier League or any rights owner isn't regulated in the UK and the European Union by all of those laws, competition law being a key one, that apply to any business is bonkers. So, of course it's heavily regulated. But let's shift back to this debate. Jonathan, I think, made the comment about woolly thinking in relation to sports bodies both being regulator and rights owner. Of course, it's not woolly thinking, it's entirely deliberate thinking. Yeah. The entire model for a great number of sports is that, and this is at federation, confederation and international federation level, is that absolutely those organisations at every level should be both the regulator, the fixture calendar or the calendar setter, and the organisation that sells international or kind of regional rights. It's entirely deliberate. That's, I think, significantly at the heart of the issue. There should be a separation. I absolutely believe there should be a separation of roles. You saw flashed up there the tennis integrity report, which actually was done by an organisation which I was the chief executive of, which was the British Horse Racing Authority, because we were saying, if you want to do an integrity review, we with all humility, believe we are the best in the world at doing this, and we can do this for you, and we did it for them. There is, in horse racing, an entire separation between the regulation of the sport and the commercial interest in the sport. I think that's a very good model. In that sport, I was responsible for spending the sport's money and had to sit down pretty much every month with the 4 parts of the sport to say, this is what we're doing in your name. I'm not going to tell you everything, because clearly, but you have to trust me, you have to have confidence in me. Here's what we're doing, here's how we're going about it. And they absolutely were happy for that to happen, back to the accountability point. That's got to happen, I think, at international level. There needs to be a separation. Perhaps this is a big test for Gianni and however long you give him in order to take these things forward before he's tested, a year, 2 years, I don't know. But at FIFA level, to separate out, and at confederation level, to separate out the regulation bit from the competition bit will be important. With a little caveat, of course, confederations don't do a great deal other than the commercial bit. They're not regulators. And that's another very interesting question as to why confederations then become also a political unit. Why is it that confederations have taken on this role as opposed to FIFA going direct to its membership? I think there's a significant question, I think, to be asked about the role of confederations in delivering that stuff up. Just one last point. Whilst advocating for good governance reasons that there should be a separation of role, I would test that against anyone in this room and those people who come back to when they see what they perceive to be an ill in the sport to say there should be one all-powerful federation, confederation or international federation that can tell everyone what to do. I think that's you can't have both. No. That's an entirely wrong model. And I would hope if there's some good coming out of the FIFA, the IAAF and everything else, that people will recognise that default to think that there should be some kind of global superpower to tell everyone what to do is wrong. Yeah.
I was going to say, could this happen in other sporting organisations? And you just said the IAAF, which is, because all sorts of parallels between what happened at the top of FIFA and the top of that organisation. Jonathan, should other sports be worried that something similar could happen?
Well, I think, again, follow the money. Formula One, the revenues for Formula One exceed those of FIFA if one takes it on a year-to-year basis in the last 16 years. The history of Formula One and commercial rights is well known. There was a de facto separation of them in the 90s. That may not have been an ideal way of doing it, but it happened. And look at the IAAF, where the allegations been made in relation to VTB, 2013 World Championships in Russia, broadcasting rights, more of the money. And I think just developing, therefore, other sports, yes, but I think FIFA's particularly a problem because of the World Cup. Nick talked about procurement in his first comments. And I completely agree, how do we regulate the procurement process for this one-way bet of the World Cup, which, as Alexandra said in her introductory remarks, has now got a reserve of over $1.5 billion. For what contingency? I mean, what is the risk? There is no risk to FIFA for the next World Cup. So other sports do, but I think it's about the money, and really one should have an entire separation, and the events aspect, commercial broadcasting rights aspect, should be regulated as a PLC.
Jane, we were talking beforehand, weren't we, about what power looks like. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying, I actually don't watch Game of Thrones, but you said that actually FIFA is a bit like Game of Thrones. Elaborate on that.
What I actually said was, if you want to learn about governance, just watch Game of Thrones, because it'll tell you everything, or read Shakespeare's history plays, which Game of Thrones is basically a rewrite of. Because governance is about what happens when human nature gets hold of power. That's all it is. And where there are huge revenue streams, then of course power follows that. And human nature being what it is, that can lead to inappropriate behaviour. So when you are trying to counter that, you need to set up a governance framework and a governance system with checks and balances, with a lot of the things that the panel have touched on. Independent directors are key. Greater transparency is key. But yeah, human nature and power, Game of Thrones.
Did it feel like that, Alexandra, when you were working on the inside?
Game of Thrones, but probably not quite as bad as that. But there was definitely this sense of perfect impunity, this sense of being untouchable, and so in that respect, it's just not that far off. I mean, at one point, I put forward the idea of independent executives on the ExCo, and Mr. Blatter just completely balked at that idea. And then he said, sort of off to the side, he said, "You are Canadian." And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "When the Canadian Parliament allows independent observers, I will allow them at FIFA." And I said, "Did you just compare yourself to a sovereign state?"
Yeah.
And he just smiled. I mean, it is not lost on them how incredibly powerful and unaccountable they have been all this time, and they're not going to give that up willingly. You know, you talk about the role of the FAs, but the FAs elect the president who distributes money to the FAs. There's a problem with that.
So as somebody who represented the government, Richard, in an attempt to win this great prize, the World Cup, why, in the end, you must have known going into it that this was Sepp Blatter's personal fiefdom.
Absolutely. And if I can just contrast, we also won an event called the Olympics in 2012, which I also was deeply involved in. And the contrast between the two bidding processes of the IOC, the reformed IOC, in the sense that after Salt Lake, Jacques Rogge came in, he restructured the whole lot, they had their ethics committee, and they also, I think, put in place, probably not the perfect, but a much, much, much improved process of transparency in the bidding process. So we came off the back of that for 2012 into bidding for a World Cup. And the contrast is very stark indeed. But the power that that bidding process has is not just financial, it is the nation. When you saw Stevie Cram and Kelly Holmes jump up in Trafalgar Square when we won the Olympic bid, that was a nation rejoicing in winning one of the biggest prizes in sport. Not for the money, but for the pride of a nation winning it. And never underestimate what that power is, because it does change a nation. And many in here, I know, who were involved in the Olympics. When you go back to the World Cup, that's the same power relationship you're in there. But that power basically was in 21, 22 people's hands. At least the Olympics, when we bid for that, and all due respect to all the French here, but we did beat Paris at the end, and that was done in a very democratic and open way. The World Cup's presentation delivery is not at all. It was absolutely corrupted from top to bottom. Unless you want to buy off some of those, as it was being seen now, it wasn't. That's why it's so important. But it's not the money. It's not just the money. It is the nation's pride at winning such a big sporting prize. It really, really is. And I think we know that. So that's why it's so important to get that right. It was corrupted. We know that now from start to finish.
But did you not know it at the time?
Of course you know it at the time, but you've got to then say to yourselves, how far are you prepared to go as a nation? And I say, we just come off the back of the bidding for the Olympics, and I'm bound to say we made a lot of mistakes, the FA, in the bidding process, and we tried to persuade them to take a different course altogether, take the course we'd done on the Olympics, which to professionalise the bidding process. The FA thought they could do it yet again themselves, which they failed, but I'm not blaming them for that. I think everybody knew you were going into somewhat of a corrupt. They'd already changed the title of the event anyway, because it was going to go around each of the continents. They said, right, one there and then Europe, one out and then Europe again. So they were actually changing those rules to suit at that time. But yeah, I think everybody knew what it was. You've got to make a judgment. You really, really have to make a judgment. Is how far are you prepared to go down that road? And I can honestly say for us, and I think I got to go with Jane here, we have got some ethics in our sport, and I believe that played out. We were not prepared to go down that route, as some seemingly did go down that route. Okay, there's a price to be paid. I think we paid that price by getting 2 votes. And that's it.
Is there any point bidding for the World Cup, men's and women's, and all women's, again?
Yeah, if the system is changed, which I hope it will be, and you know, you've got the example of Salt Lake City and the IOC. Everybody saying it was absolutely corrupted, you know, fur coats left in rooms, cars given, kids got special scholarships and all that sort of stuff were going on. I think, broadly speaking, that has now finished. I think that the IOC, and I can tell you, the rules that we played under to get the Olympics, there was a debate on one occasion, this is how daft it got, because you couldn't put any corporate, couldn't put any hospitality. We had the meeting at number 10 round the cabinet table, and the debate was, can we give them chocolate biscuits or just digestives? Because will that have to go onto the, you know, onto the declaration? That's how daft that got at one stage. But nevertheless, it went that way, and I think it's come back and is there very, and it's transparent. And I believe that system was right, and I think obviously we got the right result, but I think it was fair, as the FIFA wasn't. FIFA, I hope now, with the new regime that's going to go in, will change that, but it's a much, much wider question to that. I think these areas where you've got to decouple the commercial from the regulatory, I think that you've got to have that type of governance at the international level, it's got to be internationalised that. All that is the big debate that's taking place now. And I think the fans, the other thing you always have to remember in this as well, that we're talking a very small part of sport, we're talking that professional part of sport. I say 95% of sport is out there on the playing fields with the kids in the schools and the clubs. Okay, they look up to those, but I think below that, it is not corrupted in that sense. I think we always have to remember what we are delivering on sport, which I know there's a lot of people here in governing bodies, I've met many of them, who are delivering day in and day out for the kids who are out there on the estates that look up to these, but nevertheless actually getting their discipline and their moral values in many ways from sport. In my view, in this country and in many other countries, that's still pretty sound.
Any points from the floor at this stage? Do put your hands up and we'll get a microphone to you. Any thoughts? I see any hands twitching. It's fine, we can continue. Yes, gentleman at the front here with the red shirt.
Yeah, good morning. I'm Andy Brown from the Sports Integrity Initiative. I was just wondering the panel's thoughts on where next in terms of reforming FIFA. I was interested by Alexandra's comments, and it seems that not much has changed at FIFA. The national associations are still making all the decisions, as evidenced by what appears to be a $5 million kind of bribe by Infantino to get the national associations to vote for him. So given that we've now got the old guard facing charges in the US, how do we go about taking this forward and reforming the organisation to give it the integrity we all desire?
Alexandra, what do you think?
Well, I don't think we can fix it under the current structure because there wasn't anything against the rules in that $5 million development payment. That's part of the problem. And the people who benefit from the rules are not in a big rush to change the rules. In that scenario, the FAs would have to stand up in great indignation and say, no, stop showering us with money. And it just doesn't seem all that likely, hence the idea that you need some kind of independent oversight. And I'm not talking about some sort of global Death Star that rules everything from a single location and don't know where that location would be, but an independent team to go in and push through the sorts of changes, independent members of the EXCO and more transparency, and set it up and get it rolling and then step back again. Because otherwise, you know, you're asking them to reform themselves, and they've had a really good gig for a really long time, and I don't see any appetite for it.
I love the idea of the Death Star. Actually, that room that you showed at the beginning looked like Darth Vader's conference room. If he had one on the Death Star, it would have looked like that with the metal walls and the leather floors.
Strangest room. And I've got to say that at intervals, 2 doors open and 2 perfect women walk in and put an espresso and a chocolate in front of each of you and then glide back out again. It's a really strange place.
So interesting. Jane, you know Gianni Infantino. Mm-hmm. Is he the man, or does it actually not matter what the personnel is until the structure changes in FIFA?
Well, they have voted for a new governance structure And actually, as part of that, if I remember rightly, the president is now, in the new world, supposed to have less powers, and there's going to be a chief executive, that's not the name they've given it, it's a shift between that chairman CEO role, different from what it was. So, and I think, I do know Gianni, and he's done a good job at UEFA. UEFA, we work with closely at the Premier League on many issues. I didn't agree with everything that they did, but some of what they did, such as UEFA licensing and financial fair play, while I kind of disagreed with some of that strategically, I do accept it was a decent attempt to make European football better. I would have done some of it differently, and he was a key man in all of that. So I think we have to wait and see. But I do remain concerned that, apart from the press, and maybe apart from the American Department of Justice, who are looking at any money that flows through New York, who else is really scrutinising?
Well, I think that's true to a point, isn't it? But, I mean, the reason that I think you were brought in was because, into FIFA, was because of what the commercial side was saying. The people who were sponsoring FIFA, they said, change. And it was the reaction of Sepp Blatter to that pressure that was coming on him by the commercial, those people who were actually sponsors and the television companies that said, you better get your act. So he had to do something, and he did that by setting up, as you rightly say, the sham organisation. But if I could just make the main point on this, it is that, yes, I mean, I think governments are important, but I used to have a theory when I was in go. If sport comes off the back page onto the front page, it's usually a crisis, unless it's Leicester City. But other than that, broadly speaking, if it comes onto the front page, it's a crisis. And then what the sports minister gets is the Prime Minister's office coming on saying, what the bloody hell's happening? Get it sorted. That's the type of thing. But then once it goes back onto the back page, that's okay. But I think with the commercial...
Is the problem also that we love football so much that this is part of the issue with FIFA, that people were prepared to forget about FIFA politics because it was the World Cup, because it was the Euros, and so we were actually then, in the end, cared more about what was happening on the field?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that's true. And it's true about other sports as well, depending what country you're in. But I think what the sponsors and the television are now saying, their viewers, their customers are now questioning the product that they are sponsoring. Is it clean? Is it doing what it ought to do? And there's no doubt that whilst I accept it was the US who moved in, but the sponsors also had a major role to play in the eventual downfall of the FIFA. And I think they have now got huge power. It's how they use that power, how they use their corporate power to actually clean up sport. And how are they prepared to support that? And television companies, the BBC and the rest of them, they've got huge power in determining that. Are they prepared to use that power? I don't know. I would hope so.
I have to disagree with that.
Please do.
I think the sponsors have been absolutely tepid, and I don't think that's what prompted our IGC at all. I was first invited to join the IGC, and I did it on a part-time and pro bono basis. I was not an employee. In 2011, at which point sponsors weren't making any noise at all, and at our first meeting, Mr. Blatter said this was his initiative that he had set in motion because he wanted his legacy to be about the development of the game and not this parade of scandals. And it wasn't until just over a year ago that the sponsors started making noise, and even that noise was fairly lame. It was a lot of comments about we are very unhappy and things will have to improve. Nobody pulled contracts, nobody walked away. There were statements of unhappiness, but I think that's not what put the IGC in motion in the first place, and I think sponsors still have a lot to answer for.
But sponsors are pulling. You look at some of the sponsors, okay, not necessarily probably in FIFA, though I don't totally agree with that picture you painted there. I think it was, they played before that, they played a role in that. But you look what's happened to many of the sports people who've got into difficulty. The first thing is sponsors pull. Tiger Woods.
Is there a difference between the
individuals
and a big event like the World Cup?
I think there is, and I think because the price is so high, and therefore the decision has to be calculated in that sense, in crude terms. But I do believe the sponsors this time will get it. Now, are they prepared to put on the pressure to make sure the structures that are put in place are going to deliver clean sport, and by that give them a product that they can put genuinely to promote their brand or put onto television? And it's an area that to some extent needs to continue to be explored around that.
When I talk to companies, they say, when I talk to the marketing aspect of companies, they say, yeah, this is terrible and it would be better if FIFA cleaned up, but basically on the day when the cameras are rolling at the World Cup, we want our name there. It's just, there's a lot of cynicism around this.
Yeah.
Any more points from the floor before we move on? Yes, just over here. Put your hand up in the air, that's lovely. We'll be with you shortly. Here we go.
Hello, yes, Stuart Bannon. Presumably FIFA are subject to external audit, and external audit is subject to international accounting standards. So is this also a failure of those rules? Because that usually exposes problems like this.
Nick?
Swiss law.
Yes, I don't know the answer. Yeah, Swiss accounting practice is not
FIFA is an entity under Article 80 of the Swiss Civil Code, and it's a society, not a commercial organisation under the Swiss Code. But FIFA has always published accounts. They're on their website.
But they wouldn't tell Alexandra what Sepp Blatter was.
No, certainly not. But they're just not behaving as a commercial public limited organisation in relation to their commercial function.
Which brings me back to what I said right at the beginning, which those ordinary views as to how corporate governance works in the, for instance, a UK regulated or a US, or a kind of a market regulated environment don't apply. And which is why when we talk about governance in the context of international federations, it's not always helpful to default back to what I'm sure are an awful lot of people's daily lives, thinking about it in the corporate world, because it doesn't work. So there has to be an imposition of a different type of process. And I think this will be an interesting test for the new FIFA administration. I assume that now that we're through the early months, organisational design, I guess, will be one of the first things that Gianni comes out with. That'll be an interesting moment for him in his new exco. Just to name check one person, someone like David Gill, I think is a very good force. He agonised about whether to get involved in FIFA for very good reason, decided to do so, and I think the fact that he's there, I think is a very good thing. Anyone who's worked with David will know he takes these things very, very seriously. So I think that kind of thing about what we'd all expect the senior executive in an organisation's salary has to be put in your accounts here. That would be an interesting test for him, personally, to...
Can I just make a point about the audit in answer to that? The audits are never going to catch the off-the-books transactions. So if there is, hypothetically, a potential host country for the World Cup moving briefcases full of cash to hypothetical FA voters, that's not going to go through Zurich. It's never going to be caught by the auditors. So a lot of the malfeasance around marketing contracts, even the scalping of tickets, that's just not going to be evident from the books.
One thing, I'm going to be hopeful for a second as well. That 5 million, which when we're told the story, it makes you seriously wince. Of course, if that is up to 5 million and it genuinely has to be for audited developmental programs, and that there is a serious will within the new administration to make sure that these are programs which have to go through proper process to access the funding, subject to proper accountability mechanism, monitoring and compliance, that would be a very good thing. Because obviously the idea that $5 million in one country is the same as $5 million in another is it doesn't stack up. But if there's an up to a certain amount, and it is seriously for those development programs that back to Dick's point, we'd all absolutely want to come through across the world to promote football and the wider social responsibility that the power of football can deliver, that would be a very good thing. And maybe the political platform speech was one thing, knowing that actually the delivery mechanism was there to deliver a different outcome. So, as I say, let's have grounds for some hope. You're smiling, and maybe others are too, but I think this will be an interesting test.
No, we'll see, but there's been no appetite from headquarters before to regulate how the FA spend that money, how much of it they distribute to themselves in salary, that sort of thing. So $5 million for development of the game, I'm a big fan of that idea. $5 million left to the discretion of each individual FA, not so much.
Agreed.
I think some of the other reforms that are coming through, I think it's next week, is in Mexico, they've got a meeting FIFA, I think. I think that reform programme, genuinely, I do see it a little bit where the IOC were, that they're moving into this area where they know they've got to actually change that, and there's going to be a whole series of organisations looking into seeing what that is, and if they don't. I think that's right, and I'm with Nick, and it's not very often Nick's optimistic, but he is on this occasion, so I join Nick on that. But I hope that we can then elevate that debate as well to internationalise that. Because I think there needs to be that type of governance at the international level. If we don't, then there'll be always they can slip back. But secondly, once you've done that, I think others will aspire to do that. And you look at the struggles that Seb's having at the moment, he needs that type of support. You look what's happening in some of the other international governing bodies, they need that as well. So I am reasonably optimistic that we can actually start moving down a new governance of international sport.
And Jane, you are working at the moment, aren't you, with the UK government on a proposed new governance code.
Yes.
What's the remit of that? What will that, I mean, you can't tell us what it's going to say, obviously, because you're working on it, but what's the purpose of it?
Okay, so we're working jointly with Sport England on this UK Sports Governance Code, working title. This was announced by DCMS in their strategy in December, a document called Sporting Future. And they have said they want it to be the gold standard in sports governance. So, yeah, I've got a bit of work to do.
Pressure.
No pressure. And DCMS have also announced that compliance with it will be mandatory for any sports body that seeks public funding, which basically means the funding that we, UK Sport, channel into the elite Olympic and Paralympic programmes, and that Sport England, very much our sister organisation, channel into participation. And also, hopefully, we'll get the buy-in of the other home nations and their sports councils. But sport's a devolved matter in the UK, so that's a little bit more complex. I can't say what's in it because, again, being a governance person, I have to say, well, I'm just talking to my CEO, my board about that now, and they've got to sign it off and approve it first.
Give us a
But you won't be surprised to hear there will be, we think, or personal opinion, it's my personal opinion about where we should go with it. I think there will be a large chunk about corporate governance, which in some ways might be a bit of a lift and shift from the UK Corporate Governance Code. And I take a little bit of an issue.
I'm talking internationally, I'm not talking domestically.
I still think even so, you can draw up some principles for kind of fit-for-purpose decision-making processes and boards, and they're applicable to a range of organisations. And in a way, that's part of our challenge, because we, UK Sport, we have a kind of very simple funding landscape. I think most of the organisations we fund are national governing bodies. Sport England, it's not like that. They fund some governing bodies, they fund local authorities, they fund county sport partnerships. We've got to craft something where we can take principles and apply them across the board. The DCMS have also said in their Sporting Future strategy document that they do want it to be a model for the international world. And it is different. Sports governance at the national level is different from sports governance at the international level, because an international federation has a different set of stakeholders from a national governing body. And you've got to be smart and flexible and recognise that. But there will be some common principles. I think also what I'm finding is we've done a lot of research and consultation. I think some of the people we've spoken to are in this room. So thank you. The quality of the feedback we've got has been amazing. Everyone's got a view. It's wonderful. And one of the things I'm reflecting on is that I think where I do think you can't just say, okay, UK Corporate Governance Code applies, there you go, is a theme that's emerged from this panel. Sport is a recipient of people's passion. That's why they get involved in it. They're not just putting money in, like a shareholder in a PLC to whom the Corporate Governance Code applies. And the return they're looking for is different. Again, they're looking for basically some kind of emotional return. And so you have to recognise, and the best sports do recognise, and as I say, we're already in a good place with our governance in this country. Sports have to recognise they really are the custodians of something very precious and special. They're stewards of it, they've got to hand it on. If a commercial organisation goes bust, that's capitalism, risk is built into the model. It's sad, it sometimes happens, it's different with sports. So I think part of our trick will be to kind of recognise some of that and build in how do you discharge that guardianship role.
Can I just say, and what was really good, I mean, you're in here at the courtesy of Sports Resolution. And this is a body that's built up of getting disputes sorted out within sport, which I think is a fantastic organisation that's moved with the times and created effectively this dispute. If you look at the other side of that, what you've got with the Gambling Commission, the role the Gambling Commission played in the Olympics in putting the code in there. So we have developed a good structure, I think, for sport, you know, in resolution. I think in also intervening in areas where we saw problems arising, and that was in the whole gambling. And I think it was Jack Rogger who said that gambling is a bigger problem than drugs. I don't think he still stands to that, but that's what he was saying as we went into the Olympics, and we're trying to do that. So we have got, you know, I think some good institutions in place that's helping sport to deliver the clean sport that everybody wants.
We're going to wrap up in a second and go for coffee. But any more points? Point down here at the front, and anyone else, if you want to stick your hand up, and we'll come to you to make another quick point. But yes.
Thank you, Tom Bruce from the Sports Group at Farrow & Co. Can I just ask in relation to the new sports code, what you think the biggest challenges are in preparing that code and implementing it, and how UK Sport England would assist in resolving those challenges?
Well, as I say, I think we're lucky because we're not starting from ground zero. We're dealing with organisations who, you know, already, you know, do conduct themselves very well. There are small sports in this country, some that probably many people in the room may not have heard of because they're tiny Paralympic sports and they might cross your consciousness once every 4 years when the Paralympics are on. And I can say, hand on heart, they have some of the best sports governance in the world. So we're not starting from a baseline at all. We already have working with Sport England, quite a good and thorough assistance programme. You know, we work very closely with the sports, and one of the CEOs of our sports said to me, you give us the right mix of cajoling and support, and you've got that balance absolutely right. So yes, there will be work to do. We know that whatever the code ends up saying, and you know, I can't give you a heads up yet, but if it is setting new measures, we are very mindful that there may need to be assistance, time, etc.
And so just a final point. I mean, you say, Jane, that there are some small Paralympic sports who've got better governance than FIFA. Yes, supposedly. So I wonder... No, that's true. But can FIFA, can the IAAF... I'm kind of asking this as a semi-serious question. Can the IOC, can they learn from, I don't know, seated volleyball or boccia or goalball? What do we think? I mean, final word from you, Jane, and
yes.
Anyone else? Yeah.
Nice and simple, yes.
Yes, if they choose to, but they have to have the appetite first. They've got access to all sorts of expertise. They just have to show the will.
Possibly for me on the regulatory legislative side, but on the commercial events side, I'm afraid they should learn from the PLC corporations.
Good. Well, it's been a fascinating and broad-ranging discussion. Thank you so much to all of our panellists. And we will be resuming in about 20 minutes' time with our session on surviving abuse. So do go and have a cup of coffee, and thank you very much indeed to Richard, Jane, Nick, Alexandra and Jonathan. And thank you.